Is Israel in breach of the UN court's ruling? The International Court of Justice ordered its military to end acts of genocide, as well as to prevent incitement to commit genocidal acts. But with more Palestinians killed in Gaza every day, who can force Israel to comply? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The United Nations top court has ordered Israel to prevent and punish actions that could lead to or incite genocide in Gaza. It also ordered much-needed humanitarian aid and basic services be allowed into the Strip. The ruling was widely viewed as a step towards ending Israel's war, but in the weeks that have followed, troops have continued to act with impunity, intensifying their indiscriminate killing of Palestinians. And now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is threatening a possible military offensive in Rafah, the southernmost point of the territory. Palestinians are trapped with nowhere to go. So, what can be done to end Israel's brutality? We have plenty to discuss with our guests. But first, this report.
On January the 26th, the United Nations highest court determined there was plausible evidence of genocide in Gaza. It was a historic moment for Palestinians. The International Court of Justice then ordered Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent acts that violate the Genocide Convention. But in the days that followed, Israel seems to have ignored the ruling. In fact, according to UN expert Francesca Albanese, appears to be in breach of the court's orders. In just over 2 weeks since the ICJ ruling, the army has killed more than 2,000 Palestinians in Gaza, bringing the death toll to more than 28,000 since October the 7th. In the same period, over 3,000 people were injured. The Health Ministry warns these numbers will only rise, with victims found under the rubble every day. Albanese points to the continued demolition of infrastructure and the ongoing lack of medical supplies, food and clean water as further examples of Israel's violation of the court's orders. It could get worse. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered his military to draw up plans for a ground offensive in Rafah, in the southernmost tip of Gaza. More than 1.4 million displaced Palestinians, two-thirds of the population, are sheltering in the city. UN facilities there are operating at many times above capacity. Schools, mosques, churches and halls have become places of refuge. People are crammed into tents and makeshift shelters, while others are sleeping on the streets.
This would be a disaster if they launch an attack on Rafah. They will be the master of genocide, war criminal, I could say.
While the ICJ ruling may be a legal victory for Palestinians, many are asking how beneficial it is if Israel defies its orders in Gaza. Veronica Pedrosa, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests for today's discussion from Rafah in southern Gaza. We're joined by Yousef Hammash, a Gaza resident and advocacy officer for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Here in Doha is Mouan Rabbani, co-editor of Jazeera, an online news website. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Centre for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. And from London, we're joined by Neve Gordon, a professor of international law and human rights at Queen Mary University. Neve is also a board member of the International State Crime Initiative. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Let's start with you, Yousef. Is there any sign there that Israel is complying with the ICJ's orders?
Unfortunately, we didn't see any difference either between before the decision have been made by the ICJ or after. There is the aid is not tangible until now. We are talking about the daily average for the trucks that are allowed to enter through Rafah crossing and Kerem Shalom is 158 trucks, and the need is more than 1,000 per day. So unfortunately, the displaced families in Rafah didn't feel any tangible change with the amount of aid that came into Gaza, add to that the catastrophic situation in the northern part of Gaza and Gaza City, which unfortunately until now our hands are tied and we are not able to provide assistance to the northern part of Gaza because we don't have an access. It was allowed previously to enter for a few amount of food items, and after that, unfortunately, after the attack of one of the 8 trucks that have been delivered by UNRWA on the coastal road, none of the 8 trucks have been sent to the northern part of Gaza, and currently the population there, more than 400,000 citizens, are living through a famine, a literal famine. We used to call and demand that the situation in the north is on the verge of a famine. Currently we have a famine. Families there are eating animal food or looking for anything to feed their children, and unfortunately they don't have any options in front of the need of their children in the northern part of Gaza to provide them anything. It's a catastrophic situation in Gaza. Unfortunately, the situation hasn't been changed.
And Yousef, people must be particularly worried about Israel's threat to launch a ground offensive there in Rafah. Where will people go?
That's the question everyone's head in Rafah. Families who are being displaced in Rafah have been displaced several times. This is now, they became kind of expert in displacement. Unfortunately, all the options that we had before, personally, I live in the northern part of Gaza in Jabalia. I have fled from a place to the other 4 or 5 times. Now I don't have any other options. All of us have been trapped in Rafah, and more than 60% of the housing units in general of Gaza Strip have been destroyed. The remaining housing units are in Rafah. So even if they were pushed somewhere else from Rafah to be forced to flee again, unfortunately there is no options. We don't have any place to go. The Gaza City and the northern part of Gaza is totally destroyed. The middle area is under bombardment most of the time. On a daily basis, you're talking about loads of bombardments, several areas, Deir al-Balah, Nusayrat, al-Burej, and other areas. Now we are trapped between the Israeli tanks and the Egyptian border from the other side. So even Rafah as a city doesn't have the capacity to manage the need of all of these amount of people who've been displaced in Rafah. More than 1,500,000 citizens in 55 square kilometers in Rafah currently, without any option or solution or any hope in the horizon for a solution for the situation.
Moin Rabbani, what do you make of what you just heard there from Yousef? Is Israel in breach of the UN court's ruling?
Well, I would argue that it's more in breach of the ruling today than it was on the day that the ruling was issued. The nature and intensity of the Israeli onslaught on the Gaza Strip appears to be unchanged. What has changed is a geographical scope, which, as we've just heard, has now extended to Rafah and the southern Gaza Strip. I think the other change is that time is a factor. As we've just heard, what had been hunger and severe hunger a month ago is now an actual famine. We've also seen that Israel continues to block aid, continues to shoot up aid convoys, snipes at ambulances, killing their staff, and so on. So I really don't see any change in Israeli conduct, except for the worse. And with the additional factor of time, there's absolutely no reason that any judgment that was valid last month would not be at least equally valid today.
We'll leave the legal argument to Neve in just a moment, but politically, what can be done to force Israel to comply?
Well, this is a decision, really, that is in the hands of Israel's Western sponsors, particularly the United States and the European Union. We had a statement today, I believe, from the White House indicating that the United States does not want to see any combat in Rafah over the period of Ramadan, which begins in around March 10th, because it's concerned about the regional repercussions. But what that in effect does is give Israel a green light to continue and even intensify its campaign between now and that day. It's quite clear that if the United States wanted this to come to an end, it would take no more than a phone call from the White House to the Israeli Prime Minister, and it would end instantaneously. They've made a choice. They have made a decision. They have an ideological commitment to Israel's campaign. They are supporting it without qualification or reservations. And the consequences are what we're seeing on the ground and what our guest in Rafah just informed us about.
Neve Gordon in London, is it possible from a legal standpoint to determine yet whether Israel is in breach of the orders issued by the ICJ, requiring it to take steps to protect Palestinians' rights and to cease all activities that could constitute genocide?
I think it is possible to claim that Israel is in breach, but we are seeing that Israel is also preparing a legal defense. It's not, as the two first speakers noted, it's not changing really its strategy on the ground, but it's actually instituting three notable interventions to create a defense. First, it's launching a series of investigation into particular incidents where it says maybe war crimes were carried out. We know that from the past that these investigations usually target soldiers and not commanders, and surely not political leaders. And if we look at 2014, after Israel killed over 2,000 Palestinians, only one investigation went through, and in it, 2 soldiers were found guilty of stealing $200. So I don't think these investigations are serious, but legally they're very important. We also see how Israel's attack on the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, and the idea behind this attack is also a legal idea. First, it wants to claim that much of the evidence provided by the South African application is not true. It was given by UN bodies, and like like UNRWA, they too could be some way aligned with quote unquote terrorists, and therefore we should not believe this evidence. And second, it's using its allegations against UNRWA to stop, or to not totally stop, but to kind of limit the humanitarian aid that's coming into the Gaza Strip, saying, hey, this is a terrorist organization. We need to look closer into what is being brought in. And third, we see that there's much less genocidal incitement in the Israeli media, but it's important to understand that the issue of intent is not only the utterance of the Israeli politicians and Israeli soldiers, but it is also the kind of actions that Israel's taking. And so there's also the question of circumstantial intent, namely, if Israel attacks Rafah, it will still be South Africa will still be able to claim that it is carrying out genocide with intent.
Neve, just briefly, if you can, what legally then can be done at this stage to force Israel to comply? I mean, what are the implications here for the ICJ and its authority?
There's a few questions here. One is that the ICJ itself is only a judicial arm. It's not an executive arm. And even if tomorrow morning the ICJ ruled on a ceasefire or ruled that immediately much more humanitarian aid needs to come into Gaza, the only arm that can make Israel do that within the United Nations framework is the Security Council. The ICJ itself has no enforcement mechanism. It's the Security Council that has to rule and decide on enforcement mechanisms following an ICJ ruling. The South Africa can apply again to the ICJ and say, listen, the situation is getting worse. Israel's beginning its onslaught on Rafah. It's much more dangerous. Can you issue other measures, such as a full suspension of hostilities? Although I would say that the first initial 6 measures, the only way to comply by them is a suspension of hostilities, namely a ceasefire.
Okay. Yousef Hammash, picking up on what Neve was saying there, you touched upon it in one of your first answers. Tell us more about the situation on aid to Gaza. Israel insists that it is enabling the entrance of humanitarian aid into Gaza and is, quote, facilitating the transfer of any amount of aid requested. The scope of incoming aid is only limited, it says, by the handling capabilities of the UN and other agencies in the Gaza Strip. You're saying, though, that there's been no improvement in the delivery and availability of aid, right?
Yeah, and unfortunately, if you look to the Egyptian side, you can see how many trucks are waiting just to be allowed to be entering. There is a huge problem with the supply chain itself in terms of aid. We usually assist and do our assessment to clarify the needs that we should cover urgently, and unfortunately, within the processing, providing the aid into Gaza, the needs usually change before we have the aid tangibles in our hand. Unfortunately, if you go again to the Egyptian side of the border, you will see that hundreds of trucks are waiting to be allowed to go into the process. That it's taking really long. The amount of trucks are not covering 10% of the need. Yet 150 trucks is the average per day, while we need to recover at least 1,000 trucks per day. As long we didn't reach that number of trucks, of aid trucks into Gaza, we will still facing famine in the north, another catastrophic situation in the middle area, and another catastrophic situation in Rafah, because we are not able to do our role without having the aid. The aid is waiting on the other side of the border, waiting to be allowed on a daily basis. The trucks need to be scanned from both sides, the Egyptian side and the Israeli side. We were expecting that after opening Kerem Shalom that the number of aid trucks will increase, but unfortunately we didn't see any difference either before or after. And I don't think that we need to look about the obligations related to that. We need to think about it from a humanitarian perspective. There is a huge need. There is a catastrophic crisis, one of the most complicated crises on the planet. And I think without allowing 1,000 trucks per day, we are going to face what we are facing currently in the north. And another thing to be highlighted, that the issue in Rafah are shading what's going on the north. Unfortunately, because we don't have access either for communication, information there, we cannot be on the ground to understand exactly what's going on, but what we receive from relatives, family members, or friends from the north, it's heartbreaking. And our hands are tied in front of that, because we don't have the ability to access to the northern part and Gaza City to provide assistance for families.
We'll be talking in depth about this whole aid issue on our next Inside Story on Monday. Moan Rabbani, the ICJ's orders are a test not only of the court's authority, but of other signatories to the Genocide Convention. Why the deafening silence from many of those nations, and what pressure, if any, does Israel's failure to comply with the court's provisional orders put on the US and other Israeli allies?
Well, the court's rulings are binding on all state parties to the Genocide Convention, and that includes the United States, and that includes each and every member state of the European Union. What we've essentially seen since their initial ruling is business as usual. You take, for example, the Netherlands, where a number of human rights organizations have sued the Dutch government, seeking a court order to order the government to stop supplying spare parts for the Israeli F-35 jets that are razing the Gaza Strip to the ground. And the court ruled in favor of the government that its reliability as a supplier and as a commercial supplier trumped any other considerations, such as the government's obligations under the Genocide Convention. On Monday, there will be an appeal of this initial ruling, and it will be very interesting to see if this time the courts decide that, yes, the Genocide Convention does apply not only to adversaries and enemies of the West, but to Western governments as well. In terms of the United States, I think we have to recognize how deeply ideologically committed President Biden and his most senior aides are to an Israeli victory. The real issue with Israel is not what Israel is doing to Palestinians, but what Israel is not doing to Palestinians. In other words, Israel's failure to achieve a military victory against the Palestinian armed organizations. That is really the only significant difference between Washington and the Israeli government. And as Professor Gordon said, the ICJ does not have enforcement mechanisms, and what we've seen is Western governments essentially acting as if they're free to ignore their obligations vis-a-vis Israel and its genocidal campaign in the Gaza Strip.
Neve Gordon, what does the law say about countries like the US who hold influence over Israel, countries that are also signatories to the Genocide Convention? What are their responsibilities under international law?
They certainly cannot be complicit with genocide. And I think what Moeen showed and said is that there are several countries now that have been complicit with Israel's genocidal violence, both by supplying weapons and money and by supplying political support. And I know that there are several lawyers now preparing a case against the United States and the UK governments for complicity. I know that the Foreign Office in the UK has expressed serious concerns about Israel's committing war crimes in the Gaza Strip at a time when the UK government continues to transfer weapons to Israel. So I think these governments need to also be careful, and these leaders need to be careful that history will not judge them as taking part in one of the worst genocides in the 21st century.
Yousef Hammash, what would your message to the world be right now on this issue of whether or not Israel is complying with the ICJ's orders?
Israel not being applying to the ICJ put a new commitment to the world leaders and international community to do their role. Unfortunately, since the beginning of this war, we didn't see a real action from the world leaders, US which represents itself as a country who is leading the world. Unfortunately, we are not seeing a real efforts towards stopping what's going on. What's taking place in Gaza is inhuman, and we don't see a real action from the international community and world leaders. Once again, we are failing, and the international community is failing us as Palestinians here in Gaza. From the international community to the Security Council, to the United Nations, now the ICJ, I think that no more efforts can be done for Palestinians, and that was the last step that could be done towards trying to save the lives of Palestinians in Gaza under this madness. And we don't see a real action, and unfortunately they had to stand ahead their responsibilities because they will be held responsible in front of us and the history itself.
Moeen Rabbani, what are the implications then for the Israeli political establishment on deciding whether to comply or not with the court's provisional orders? And is Israel's military in lockstep here with the government, or is there some unease in the military?
I'm sure there's unease at the level of both political and military leadership, unease about being put under scrutiny, and I think unease at the tremendous moral and political loss that they've incurred by now being found to be plausibly committing genocide, particularly given that Israel is so reliant on the goodwill of Western public opinion, and that much of that support comes from the image of Israel as being somehow reparations for the Nazi Holocaust. Now Israel is associated with genocide as a perpetrator and not only as a victim. So this will have severe long-term consequences. But I think in the present moment, I think the Israeli leadership isn't really looking at the fine points of the law. It's not even looking at The Hague, and Netanyahu was very clear that he won't be affected by anything coming out of The Hague in terms of this military campaign. he's looking at Washington, and he's looking at Brussels. Those are his political and, for that matter, legal terms of reference. And it will be on the basis of what emanates from those two capitals that he will decide what he will and will not do next.
Neve, do you want to pick up on what Moin was saying there? Israel, of course, has a history of pushing the limits of international law. I wonder to what extent Israel's government is circumventing its own domestic legal system to justify its actions in Gaza.
Well, we have not seen a substantial increase in humanitarian as demanded by the court. We have not seen a significant change in the repertoires of violence deployed in Gaza and a decrease in the killing of civilians. Indeed, I think we're seeing the same level of civilian death as we saw before the court ruling. So again, it's a contravention of the court. And we have not seen any indictments and even investigations of those inciting genocidal violence, again, as demanded by the court. So the Israeli government, I think, has decided that in many ways it is going to ignore the court. We do see the legal establishment, as I pointed out earlier, preparing a legal defense. But I think we also have to remember that Netanyahu has a personal interest to continue with this war on the Palestinian people, because he knows that the minute he will stop this war, then he will be under immense investigation, and the Israeli public will demand his resignation. So the only what is keeping Netanyahu actually in power is the war, and therefore he's saying, as I think Moin Rabbani said before, that despite what the international community said, despite what the court said, despite even what the President of the United States has said, he's going on and instructing the military to go into Rafah. And so I think there's now a kind of clash between a certain legal establishment within Israel that still respects the idea of the ICJ and the political and military leadership in the country.
All right. There, gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it. Many thanks to you all, Yousef Hammash, Moin Rabbani, and Neve Gordon. As always, thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X, our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. See you again. Bye for now.